Hit the subscribe button. Once you hear what they found under that church floor, you'll never look at Sunday service the same way again. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning in the small Louisiana town of St. Lorne. The sun rose over the cypress trees, lighting up the white steeple of St. Matthew's Church, a landmark everyone knew, a place where generations prayed, married, and buried their dead. But that morning, yellow police tape flapped in the humid wind around the churchyard. Officers stood in small clusters, whispering. Something had been found in the basement. Detective Claire Bennett arrived just before noon. She'd been with the parish sheriff's department for 15 years, long enough to know that St. Lorne wasn't a place where strange things stayed buried for long. The call had been brief. Human remains discovered during renovation work under St. Matthew's Church. Inside, the air was damp, filled with dust and decay. Construction workers had been reinforcing the foundation when their jackhammer broke through a section of old flooring. Beneath it was a hollow space, sealed decades ago. When one worker crawled in with a flashlight, he screamed. The light had caught what looked like the curve of a skull. Claire crouched at the hole, her gloved hand brushing away debris. The beam of her flashlight trembled slightly as she saw it for herself. Not just one, but two small skeletons, side by side, their hands nearly touching. Between them lay the rusted remnants of a rosary. "Jesus," muttered one of the officers behind her. Claire exhaled slowly. "Get forensics, and close this place down. Nobody goes in or out without clearance." The discovery hit St. Lorne like a shockwave. For the first time in decades, people began whispering again about the vanished children of 2008. 8-year-old twins, Rebecca and Samuel Miller, who disappeared after choir practice one evening and were never found. The case had gone cold within a year, the parents eventually moving away under the weight of grief and suspicion. But now, 12 years later, Claire was standing over what might finally be the answer, or at least part of it. By nightfall, the forensic team had retrieved the remains. Early analysis confirmed they were children, aged between 7 and 9. The timeline fit perfectly. And near the smaller skeleton, they found something else. A metal pendant, flattened with age but still legible. It bore the initials AC. The next morning, St. Lawrence local news was ablaze with the story. Reporters gathered by the church fence, shoving microphones through the gaps. Parishioners wept openly, others prayed. But Claire's instincts buzzed uneasily. If this was the Miller case, it raised more questions than answers. Why had the children been buried under a church? Who had access to that basement? And what did those initials mean? She drove to the address of Father Andrew Collins, the longtime priest of St. Matthew's during that era. He'd retired 5 years earlier, citing health reasons, and now lived quietly in a cottage outside town. When he opened the door, Claire saw a frail man with watery blue eyes and trembling hands. "Detective Bennett," he said softly. "I heard about the discovery. I knew this day would come." That line froze her. "You knew?" He hesitated. "Not exactly. I suspected." Claire's eyes narrowed. "You want to explain that?" Father Collins invited her inside. The cottage smelled of incense and old paper. Religious icons lined the walls, but the place felt heavy, suffocating even. He sat slowly in a wooden chair and folded his hands. "There were things that happened at St. Matthew's back then. Things I didn't understand, or perhaps chose not to." He went on to describe the church's former caretaker, Deacon Michael Reeves, a quiet, dutiful man who lived in a small house behind the rectory. He'd worked there for nearly 20 years, managing everything from lighting candles to cleaning confessionals. He said, "The children trusted him. Everyone did." When the twins vanished, Reeves had been among the first to join the search parties. He cried openly during services, sat with the grieving parents. But a year after the disappearance, he abruptly left St. Lorne, claiming he needed to care for an ailing mother in Alabama. No one ever saw him again. Claire's pulse quickened. "Did you report that?" "I tried," he murmured, staring down. "But without proof, without a body," the sheriff said there was nothing they could do. She studied him closely. His fingers twitched over the arms of the chair, his lips trembling. "Father, what aren't you telling me?" He looked up then, tears welling. I heard them once. The children, crying, beneath the altar. I thought it was my imagination. I prayed for forgiveness ever since. Claire stood in stunned silence. The old priest covered his face, shaking. She left his house shaken, her recorder still running in her pocket, his confession now captured, his guilt tangible. The next day, she and her partner Marcus Hayes returned to St. Matthew's. The church was sealed and quiet, the air thick with mildew and history. As they descended the narrow staircase into the basement, the smell of damp earth filled their lungs. The forensic team had already packed up, but the hole remained, a jagged wound in the concrete floor. Marcus scanned the walls with his flashlight. You see that? There, carved faintly into the stone, were tiny crosses and childlike initials scratched into the mortar. Some overlapped, others looked desperate, etched deep as though by trembling hands. One message near the far corner made Claire's breath catch. It read, "We can hear him upstairs." The handwriting was childish. A chill crawled up her spine. They were alive down here. Marcus turned pale. Jesus Christ, Claire. They were buried alive. She stared into the darkness of that sealed room, the faint smell of decay mixing with the cold whisper of air rising from the cracks. The rosary, the initials, the cries Father Collins had heard. It was all connected, but how? Before they left, Claire noticed something glinting between the stones. She pried it loose carefully with a gloved hand. It was a small brass key, old and bent. On its tag, written in fading ink, were the same initials they'd found on the pendant, AC. That night, the storm rolled over St. Lorne. Lightning flashed across the sky as Claire sat in her office, staring at the key on her desk. AC. Andrew Collins, the priest. Could it be coincidence? Or was the man who claimed to have suspected more involved than he admitted? Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. You need to see this. Reeves never left town. Check the property records. Claire's heart dropped. She opened the attached file. The name on the old deed to the small house behind the rectory hadn't changed in 12 years. It was still registered to Michael Reeves, the caretaker who supposedly vanished. But recent utility bills showed activity. Lights, water, even heat, all paid for from an untraceable bank account. Someone had been there. Recently. She grabbed her coat, heart pounding. As thunder cracked outside, she whispered to herself, maybe the church wasn't the only place hiding bodies.
Rain hammered the windshield as Claire's unmarked car rolled up the narrow gravel road behind St. Matthew's. The church loomed in the distance, lightning cutting its white steeple into sudden, violent flashes. Her headlights swept over the caretaker's old house, a sagging one-story cabin half swallowed by vines, the windows black as if they'd been waiting for her. She stepped out into the storm, pulling her coat tight. The mud sucked at her boots as she moved toward the porch. Every instinct screamed that she shouldn't be alone. But waiting for backup meant giving whoever was inside more time to hide or run. The front door was locked, but not tight. The brass key she'd found in the basement trembled in her fingers as she slid it into the rusted knob. For a heartbeat, it didn't fit. Then it clicked. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with rot and silence. The smell of mildew mixed with something older, something sour and metallic that made her throat tighten. Dust motes swirled in the beam of her flashlight. A crucifix hung crooked above the entryway. Beneath it, on a side table, sat a small music box shaped like a chapel. When she brushed it accidentally, it came to life, playing a warped, off-key lullaby that filled the house like a ghost breathing. She froze. The melody was the same one the twins' mother had said Rebecca used to hum before bed. Claire's pulse hammered. She swept the light across the living room. Stacks of yellowed newspapers lined the walls, some dated as far back as 2008. She crouched to look closer. Headlines about the missing Miller twins, the church's community vigils, even early articles naming suspects. Michael Reeves had kept every single one. In the corner stood an armchair draped in a blanket. On the small table beside it lay a set of rosary beads, worn smooth from years of use. Next to them, a framed photograph. Claire lifted it slowly. It was Father Collins and Michael Reeves, smiling outside St. Matthew's, arms around each other. The twins stood between them in white choir robes, grinning. A small caption on the frame read, "Choir Sunday, 2008. Lightning cracked again, illuminating something else behind the chair. Faint dark stains on the floorboards. She knelt down. The wood was warped, slightly discolored, as though something heavy had once been dragged across it. She followed the marks toward a rug at the center of the room and pulled it back. Beneath was a trapdoor. Her chest tightened. She texted Marcus her location, then drew her weapon and gripped the handle. The hinges groaned as she lifted it. A waft of cold, stale air rushed out, smelling of earth and oil. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Claire aimed her flashlight down the steps. Wooden shelves lined the small cellar, filled with jars, tools, and boxes. But something was wrong. Too organized. Too deliberate. This wasn't just storage, it was a collection. She took a careful step down. The rain outside muted into a low hiss as she reached the floor. Her light landed on the nearest shelf. Glass jars labeled in neat handwriting. Choir robes, 2008. Sunday shoes. Rebecca's locket. Each item inside was sealed, preserved. She swallowed hard and turned toward the far wall. There, pinned like trophies, were dozens of photographs of children from the parish over the years. Some were marked with red circles, others crossed out. And in the center, a single newspaper clipping read, "Deacon Reeves receives Church Service Award, 2006. A sudden creak above her made her whip around. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Someone was upstairs. She killed her flashlight, heart racing. Rainwater dripped through cracks in the ceiling, tapping rhythmically against the concrete floor. Whoever was up there was moving toward the trap door, the same one she'd left open. Claire ducked behind a support beam and drew her gun. The trap door creaked again. A beam of light cut into the cellar. A voice, low and rasped with age, echoed down. "Detective Bennett, you shouldn't be here." It was Father Collins. Claire's grip tightened. "Step away from the door, Father." He didn't. Instead, his shadow descended one slow step at a time. "You don't understand what you found. This isn't what you think. You buried them under your church. 2 children, Father. You called it the house of God." Collins reached the bottom step, his pale face flickering in the half-light. "I didn't bury them. I tried to protect them. From him." "Him?" "Reeves," he whispered. "He took them. I heard the crying that night. I followed the sound, but by the time I opened the basement door, it was too late. He told me it was an accident, that he was trying to cleanse them of sin. I wanted to go to the police, but he said no one would believe a priest who failed to protect his flock." Claire's jaw clenched. "So you helped him hide the bodies." Tears welled in his eyes. "I sealed that basement myself. I thought if I buried the secret, the church would be spared. I thought God would forgive me." Her flashlight trembled as she backed away, the beam catching something behind him, a shadow moving in the stairwell. "Father, get down," she shouted. But it was too late. A figure lunged from the darkness, slamming into Collins with a guttural cry. The flashlight flew from Claire's hand and shattered against the wall. For a moment, there was chaos. The sound of struggle, a grunt, a sickening crack. She fired once, the flash illuminating a face twisted in fury, the unmistakable aged features of Michael Reeves. He was alive. The shot missed, sparking against stone. Reeves shoved the priest aside and bolted up the stairs. Claire raced after him, slipping on the wet steps, her lungs burning. She burst through the door into the storm, rain slicing across her face. The flashlight from her belt flicked on again, catching a glimpse of him running toward the churchyard, coat flapping, hair wild. "Reeves, stop!" she yelled. He didn't. He sprinted across the yard, vanished around the side of the church. Claire chased him through puddles, her gun steady despite her shaking hands. As she turned the corner, the beam of her light swept across the chapel wall and froze. The old wooden door to the church basement was wide open. She entered slowly, breath heavy, the sound of the storm muffled by the stone walls. Inside, faint candlelight flickered. Reeves stood by the altar, soaked and trembling, his eyes wide with something between rage and repentance. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said, voice cracking. "They should have stayed safe down there. They should have been pure." "You murdered them," Claire said, keeping her aim steady. "You call that purity?" He shook his head violently. "No, the Father wanted it. He said they were chosen. I only did what he told me." Claire froze. "The Father Collins told you?" Reeves' eyes gleamed. "He said they were the first sacrifices, that it was God's will to rebuild the faith. I just did the work." Before she could respond, a gunshot shattered the air. Reeves stiffened, blood blooming across his chest. Behind him, on the steps, stood Father Collins, holding Claire's backup weapon. His face was calm, almost peaceful. "She doesn't understand," Collins said softly, stepping closer. "The children were angels, Detective. They were never supposed to be found." Claire's gun snapped toward him. "Drop it, Father." But his hand didn't tremble. He looked past her, toward the altar, as if hearing something she couldn't. Then, slowly, he smiled. "The Church forgives all sins," he whispered. The second shot rang out. When the echoes faded, only the rain remained. Collins crumpled beside Reeves, both men lying in pools that shimmered red under the candlelight. The silence that followed was so deep it hurt. Claire lowered her weapon, chest heaving, the truth settling like lead in her stomach. Two men of faith, two monsters, and the secret they'd buried together had festered for 12 years beneath holy ground. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a faint outline on the wall behind the altar. Words carved deep into the wood long ago. "Forgive us, Father. He said we'd see the light." She reached out, fingertips tracing the letters. Her heart dropped when she realized the handwriting wasn't adult. It was the twins.
Outside, sirens finally wailed through the rain. Rain still clung to St. Lorne by dawn. The storm had eased into a gray drizzle that coated the town in silence. Police cruisers surrounded St. Matthew's Church, their red and blue lights flashing weakly against the mist. Paramedics rolled 2 black bags past the iron gates, the priest and the deacon, side by side at last. Reporters already crowded outside the yellow tape, shouting questions that no one would answer. Detective Claire Bennett stood near the back pews, soaked to the bone, her hands trembling despite the coffee someone had handed her. Every detail of the night replayed in her mind like static. Reeves's last words, the way Father Collins smiled before pulling the trigger, the inscription carved by children who'd known they would die. But the part that unsettled her most wasn't the blood or the confession. It was that one word: sacrifices. She'd heard plenty of killers use faith as a crutch, but Collins hadn't sounded delusional. He'd sounded certain, as if this ritual had been part of something larger, something sanctioned. "Claire," Marcus said, approaching from the doorway. His face was pale. "You'll want to see this." They ducked under the police tape into the rectory office. Folders and ledgers were spread across the desk. Marcus flipped one open and pointed at a list of handwritten entries, large, regular payments, cash deposits made monthly to Diocesan Restoration Fund. But the account number wasn't linked to the diocese. It traced to a shell organization registered in Baton Rouge. Claire frowned. A fund no one's ever heard of, connected to a church basement where 2 children were buried alive? "And here's the kicker," Marcus said. "That fund didn't stop after the Millers disappeared. It's still active." She stared at him. "You're saying someone else is still moving money?" "Yeah, and get this, last withdrawal was yesterday." Her blood went cold. Reeves and Collins were both dead, so who was still cashing the checks? By noon, they were on the road to Baton Rouge, the sky bruised with leftover storm clouds. The GPS led them to an unmarked building on the edge of an industrial park. Faded sign, Lorne Community Outreach. It looked abandoned, but a fresh set of tire tracks glistened in the mud outside. Claire and Marcus moved in quietly, guns drawn. The lock was old but easy to break. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and paper, that sterile odor of bureaucracy masking something rotten. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls. An office desk sat under a single buzzing fluorescent light. On it, a folder marked with a red cross. Marcus flipped it open. Dozens of photographs spilled out, black and white shots of children in choir robes. Each had a name scrawled beneath, followed by a date. Some were stamped, transferred. Transferred where? Claire muttered. Marcus reached deeper into the drawer and froze. Claire, you need to see this. It was a ledger, the same handwriting as the church books. Next to the financial entries were coded initials, RM, SM, EG, JR. Each pair corresponded to a deposit date, each date followed by the same chilling note in the margin, returned to the light. Claire's breath hitched. Return to the light? That's what the twins carved. She flipped another page. Near the bottom, a newer entry caught her eye. Last week's date, with the initials CB. Marcus glanced over her shoulder. That's you. Her pulse thundered. It's a threat, she whispered. Someone knew I was coming. Before they could move, a low hum filled the air, then a soft click. The lights cut out. Silence. Then faint footsteps on concrete. Claire grabbed her flashlight and swept it toward the sound. Police! Show me your hands! The beam caught a figure near the exit, a woman in her 60s, wearing a nurse's uniform under a heavy raincoat. Her face was gaunt, eyes hollow but strangely calm. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. They're watching. Who? Claire demanded. Who is behind this? The woman hesitated. It didn't start in St. Lorne. That church was just the beginning. They said they were saving the pure ones, cleansing them before the world corrupted them. It was supposed to be mercy. Marcus stepped forward. Who told you that? Her eyes flickered toward the ledger. The bishop, she whispered, and the ones above him. You think Collins was the monster? He was just the shepherd. They're still out there. Before Claire could question further, the woman's gaze shifted, past them, toward the doorway. Fear widened her eyes. They found us! A silenced gunshot cracked the air. The woman collapsed, a blood of red spreading across her chest. Claire dove for cover as glass shattered behind her. Marcus returned fire toward the entrance, but whoever had shot was gone before they reached the door. Tires screeched outside, a black sedan fishtailing onto the road before disappearing into traffic. Claire knelt beside the dying woman. Her lips trembled, forming barely a whisper. Check the church registry. Basement. Second. And then nothing. Her eyes glazed. Marcus wiped blood from his cheek. Jesus Christ. We need backup. Claire shook her head. No. If what she said is true, we can't trust anyone yet. We finish this ourselves. By nightfall, they were back at St. Matthew's. The church sat quiet, emptied of reporters and police. Inside, flashlights cut through the darkness. The smell of wax and decay hung heavy. Claire moved to the pulpit, tracing her light along the floorboards. The woman's last words echoed. Church registry, basement, second. The first basement was where the twins were found, but there was no second. Unless it was beneath that. Marcus helped pry up the tiles near the altar. Under the concrete, another layer of boards emerged, thinner, newer. They used a crowbar to lift it, revealing a hidden staircase descending even deeper into the earth. The air that rushed out was colder, older. The passageway was narrow, lined with bricks blackened by time. The smell of dust and something chemical filled their lungs. As they descended, faint light flickered from below, candles burning in a stone chamber. At the center of that room stood an altar. Upon it, old photographs, rosaries, and bone fragments arranged in a grotesque pattern. Around the walls, dozens of names etched into plaster. Some were familiar from the ledger, others unknown. At the far end, a plaque read,
The light of the Lamb, rejoice, for the pure have ascended. Claire stared in horror. This wasn't one man's madness, she whispered. It was an organization. Marcus lifted his phone to record, his voice trembling. This goes all the way up. A metallic click echoed behind them. They turned. A silhouette stood in the doorway. It was Sheriff Dorsey, our own superior, holding a gun. His face was pale, almost regretful. I told you you'd dig too deep. You should have left the past alone. Claire's heart dropped. You knew. I kept the town safe. The church paid for the orphanages, the shelters. You think those came from donations? There's always a price for salvation. Marcus raised his gun. Drop it. Dorsey smiled sadly. You can't kill faith, son. He fired first. The bullet caught Marcus in the shoulder. Claire screamed, firing back instinctively, the shot echoing off stone, striking Dorsey square in the chest. He fell backwards against the altar, the candles toppling around him. Flames spread fast across the dry fabric and old paper. Claire grabbed Marcus, dragging him toward the stairs. Smoke filled the tunnel as they stumbled upward, coughing, the fire raging below. When they burst through the church doors into the night, the first flames were already licking the stained glass windows. The steeple glowed red against the storm clouds as fire trucks wailed in the distance. They watched in silence as the roof caved in, sparks spiraling into the dark sky. The church that had hidden a decade of horror was finally burning to the ground. Weeks later, the FBI's report would confirm everything. The Light of the Lamb cult had infiltrated several parishes across the South, using faith-based charities as fronts for human trafficking and ritual killings masked as religious sacrifice. St. Matthew's had been their first hub. The Vatican issued denials. The diocese released statements of sorrow, but no one claimed responsibility for the hidden ledger funds that still moved quietly through international accounts. Claire testified before the federal panel, her voice steady, but her hands cold. When they asked why she risked her life to uncover something so dangerous, she paused before answering. Because the truth was under our feet, and every time we looked away, it kept growing. After the hearings, she drove back to St. Lorne. The ruins of the church were still fenced off, blackened stone jutting from the earth like broken teeth. In the center of the ash, she found a fragment of marble, part of the altar plaque. Only 2 words were still legible. The light. As she turned it over, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting
Long shadows across the burned ground. For a moment, she thought she heard the faintest echo of children singing, a melody she hadn't heard since that night in the caretaker's house. But when she looked up, there was only wind. Claire placed the fragment on the soil and whispered, "Rest now." Then she walked away, the sound of distant church bells ringing from somewhere far beyond St. Lorne. They thought the cult was gone, but 3 months later, another church renovation in Kentucky uncovered a sealed basement with the same carvings, the same rosaries, and the same initials in the walls. If you think this story was dark, the next one will take you even deeper. Subscribe, because the truth never stays buried.